There is a grand house on Penn Avenue in Pittsburgh's Point Breeze neighborhood, a house with 23 rooms wrapped in honey-colored sandstone and Victorian ornament, a house where the curtains still hang precisely as they did in 1892, where the china remains stacked in careful rows, where the toys sit frozen in eternal childhood, and if you stand very still in the entrance hall you can almost hear the echoes, not of laughter, though there was some of that, but of something darker. Something that smells like coke smoke and blood and the particular silence that follows violence, because this is Clayton, the mansion of Henry Clay Frick, and while its walls have been scrubbed and its floors polished and its legacy carefully curated into something approaching respectability, the house remembers what its master did to build it, the men who died in his coke ovens with their lungs turned to ash, the workers who bled out on the banks of the Monongahela River while fighting his hired Pinkerton mercenaries, the children who went hungry in company towns where Frick paid starvation wages and charged inflated prices at company stores, and the question that hangs in every restored room is not whether you can separate the beauty from the blood, but whether you should even try, whether it is possible to admire the imported mahogany and the Tiffany glass and the carefully preserved nursery without acknowledging that every luxury, every comfort, every perfectly placed artifact was purchased with human suffering on an industrial scale, that this house is not merely a museum of Gilded Age excess but a monument to the fundamental lie at the heart of American capitalism, the fiction that great wealth is earned rather than extracted, that the glittering surfaces are not hiding anything, that the cost was ever worth paying. And so we must begin not with the fairy tale of a self-made man rising from modest Mennonite stock to become one of America's wealthiest industrialists, but with the darker truth, with the cold morning of July 6, 1892, when 300 Pinkerton agents arrived by barge at Frick's Homestead steel mill to break a strike and found 10,000 townspeople waiting with rifles and dynamite, when the Pinkertons tried to land at 4 in the morning in the pre-dawn darkness, believing they could slip ashore and seize the mill before anyone knew what was happening. But the workers had been warned, had been watching, had been preparing for this exact moment, and as the barges approached the landing they were met with gunfire, with shouting, with men and women and even children lining the banks ready to defend their town, their livelihoods, their dignity against the private army that Henry Clay Frick had purchased to crush them, and what followed was not a skirmish but a battle, a 12-hour siege in which the Pinkertons, trapped on their barges, tried repeatedly to land and were repeatedly driven back, in which workers poured oil on the river and tried to set it on fire, in which they rolled a burning railroad car down the tracks toward the barges, in which they threw sticks of dynamite that exploded in the water, in which rifle fire cracked across the valley and bullets tore through wood and flesh, in which the Pinkertons, realizing they were outgunned and surrounded, raised white flags multiple times only to open fire again when workers approached, in which the line between law and chaos, between order and anarchy, between civilization and savagery dissolved entirely, and when the Pinkertons finally surrendered in the late afternoon, when they stumbled off the barges with their hands up, they were met by a gauntlet of furious townspeople who beat them with fists and clubs and anything they could find, women whose husbands worked in the mill hitting the hired thugs with umbrellas, children throwing stones, men who had lost friends in the fighting taking their revenge on the mercenaries who had come to steal their jobs, and by the time it was over, by the time the smoke cleared and the bodies were counted, at least 3 Pinkertons lay dead along with 7 workers, though the real toll was certainly higher because many wounded men would die in the coming days from infections and blood loss, and dozens more on both sides carried injuries they would bear for the rest of their lives, and the Monongahela River, that great artery of industrial Pittsburgh, ran red in the afternoon light, and the town of Homestead stood in shock at what it had done, at the violence it had been forced to commit, at the realization that in America in 1892 you could be killed by a private army for the crime of wanting fair wages, and Henry Clay Frick, sitting in his office in Pittsburgh just 10 miles away, received telegrams updating him on the battle as it unfolded, and his response was not horror, not regret, not any recognition that perhaps hiring 300 armed mercenaries to invade a town in the middle of the night might have been a miscalculation, but rather a cold determination to see it through, to break the strike, to break the union, to break the will of workers who had dared to believe they deserved a voice in determining their wages and working conditions, and that night, as the sun set over the still-burning barges and the people of Homestead buried their dead and tried to understand what had just happened, Frick returned to Clayton, to this house on Penn Avenue where Adelaide and the surviving children waited, where 11 servants prepared dinner and turned down beds and stoked fires and performed all the invisible labor that made the Frick family's comfort possible, where the gas lamps glowed warm against the summer darkness and the imported wallpaper gleamed and the carefully tended gardens bloomed in oblivious beauty, and Frick, whatever he felt, whatever nightmares might have troubled his sleep, whatever doubts might have flickered through his mind in the quiet moments, did not waver, did not compromise, did not show weakness, because Henry Clay Frick had built his entire fortune on the understanding that sentiment was a luxury only the poor could afford, that success required ruthlessness, that the world was divided between those who took and those who were taken from, and he had always known which side he was on, had known it from childhood, from the moment he first understood that his grandfather Abraham Overholt's whiskey fortune meant that the Fricks, despite their Mennonite heritage of plain living and simple faith, were different from the laborers and farmers who worked the land around West Overton, that money created a separate reality, a separate set of rules, a separate moral universe in which the powerful did not answer to the same laws as everyone else, and this lesson, absorbed young and never forgotten, shaped everything that Henry Clay Frick became, shaped his decision at age 21 to borrow money from his mother and from the banker Thomas Mellon, who saw in young Frick the same cold calculation that animated his own fortune, and buy up coal lands in the Connellsville region 40 miles south of Pittsburgh, coal lands that everyone knew contained some of the finest coal in the world, coal that when converted to coke produced a fuel so pure and hot that it revolutionized steel production, making it possible to produce stronger steel in greater quantities than ever before, and Frick, with a vision that was both brilliant and terrible, understood that whoever controlled the coke supply would control the steel industry, would control Pittsburgh, would control the industrial future of America, and so he built not just ovens but an empire, starting with 50 ovens in 1870 and expanding relentlessly, buying up competitors, underselling rivals, consolidating control until by 1880 he owned 1,500 ovens arrayed across the Connellsville coalfields like an industrial hell that Dante could not have imagined, beehive ovens that stood 12 feet high and burned day and night, 3,000 tons of coal converted to 2,000 tons of coke every single day, the ovens glowing orange against the night sky, visible for miles, the smoke so thick that the sun barely penetrated, the air so poisoned that trees would not grow, that paint peeled from houses, that children coughed blood, that life expectancy for the men who worked there was measured in years not decades, because working a coke oven was not a job but a death sentence, a slow murder by heat and poison and exhaustion, and the men who did this work, the Hungarian and Polish and Italian and Slovak immigrants who came to America believing the promise that hard work would be rewarded, that opportunity was real, that their children could have better lives, these men found themselves trapped in company towns where Frick owned not just the ovens but the houses, the stores, the very air they breathed, where wages were paid in scrip that could only be spent at company stores that charged inflated prices for basic goods, where any complaint, any resistance, any attempt to organize was met with immediate firing and eviction, where the work itself was a nightmare of heat and danger, shoveling coal into ovens that radiated temperatures hot enough to blister skin from 6 feet away, breathing air so thick with sulfur dioxide and carbon monoxide that men would pass out and fall into the ovens and burn alive, and this was not rare, not exceptional, but routine, expected, a cost of doing business that Frick calculated with the same cold precision he applied to every other variable in his empire, because to Frick these workers were not people but inputs, interchangeable units of labor that could be used up and replaced from the endless stream of immigrants pouring into America, desperate for work, willing to accept any conditions, any wages, any indignity because the alternative was starvation, and Frick exploited this desperation without mercy, without hesitation, without any visible sign that he understood or cared that the men dying in his ovens had families, had hopes, had dreams, had believed in a promise that was revealed as a lie. The moment they descended into the coke region's industrial hell, and yet Frick did not see himself as a villain, this is crucial to understand, he saw himself as a builder, as a creator, as a man doing the hard necessary work of transforming America from an agricultural backwater into an industrial superpower, and by the logic of capitalism, by the ethics of the market, by the social Darwinism that was the unofficial religion of the Gilded Age, he was right, he was successful, he was winning. And winning was the only moral standard that mattered, and his success attracted the attention of Andrew Carnegie, the Scottish immigrant who had clawed his way up from poverty to become the Steel King of America, who in 1881 made Frick a partner in his steel operations, recognizing in Frick not just a supplier of coke but a kindred spirit, a man who understood that building an empire required brutality, required the willingness to do what others would not, required a commitment to profit that superseded all other considerations including human decency, and Carnegie, who liked to present himself as a friend to workers, as a believer in unions, as a philanthropist who would give away his fortune to libraries and universities and worthy causes, Carnegie who wrote essays about the gospel of wealth and the responsibilities of the rich. This same Carnegie put Frick in charge of operations and told him to maximize productivity by any means necessary, and then conveniently absented himself. When those means proved violent, leaving Frick to absorb the blame, to take the bullets, to become the public face of industrial warfare while Carnegie maintained his carefully crafted image as a benevolent genius, and Carnegie was in Scotland that summer of 1892, safely distant from the bloodshed he had authorized, able to claim ignorance, able to express shock and dismay when the news reached him, able to condemn the violence while reaping its benefits, and this cowardice, this strategic absence, this willingness to let Frick take the fall while Carnegie protected his reputation, would eventually poison their partnership beyond repair, but in 1892 they were still allies, still partners in the great project of industrial domination, still united in their determination to break the unions, to drive down wages, to maximize profits regardless of human cost. But we are getting ahead of ourselves again, because before Homestead, before the partnership with Carnegie fully soured, before Frick became the most hated man in America, there was Clayton, there was Adelaide, there was the attempt to build something like a normal family life, and this is where the story becomes most complex, most contradictory, most resistant to simple interpretation, because the same man who ruthlessly exploited workers and hired private armies and showed no mercy to anyone who stood between him and profit, this same man was also a devoted husband who loved Adelaide deeply, who grieved profoundly when their children died, who wanted to create a home that was not just a display of wealth but a genuine sanctuary, a place where he could be something other than the Coke King, the Steel Baron, the ruthless capitalist, and Adelaide Howard Childs, who married Henry Clay Frick in December 1881, came from Pittsburgh society, from a family of means and respectability, her father Asa P. Childs a successful shoe manufacturer, and she brought to the marriage not just money and social connections but genuine affection, and the early years of their marriage, as they moved into Clayton and started their family, seemed to have been genuinely happy, filled with the ordinary joys and challenges of young parenthood, and the house itself, in those early days, was modest by the standards Frick would later achieve, just 11 rooms, comfortable but not ostentatious, a home that suggested success without screaming wealth, and Adelaide furnished it with care, with attention to creating a space that was warm and welcoming, where children could play and guests could gather and life could unfold in relative normalcy. And when Childs was born in March 1883, and then Martha in 1885, and then Helen in 1888, Clayton must have seemed like it was fulfilling its purpose, like the Fricks were building not just a fortune but a family, not just an empire but a legacy, and Adelaide threw herself into motherhood with the same devotion she brought to everything, reading to the children, teaching them, playing with them in the nursery that still stands preserved with its dollhouse and rocking horse and carefully arranged toys. And there are photographs from this period, stiff formal portraits in which Adelaide holds baby Helen while Martha and Child stand nearby in their finest clothes, and you can see in these photographs something that looks like contentment, like pride, like the satisfaction of having achieved what society told them they should want. But then came the tragedies, came Martha's death in 1891. Just weeks before her 6th birthday, came the loss of Henry Clay Frick Jr. in infancy in 1892, came the realization that wealth could not protect against grief, that all the money in the world could not keep death out of the nursery, could not save a sick child, could not guarantee the future that Frick was working so hard to secure, and these losses, coming so close together, devastated Adelaide in ways that she never fully recovered from, and they changed Frick too, hardened him perhaps, or maybe revealed a hardness that had always been there, because his response to grief was not to withdraw or to question or to soften but to build, to expand, to assert control over the material world since the spiritual world had proved so cruelly beyond his reach, and it was in 1891, in the immediate aftermath of Martha's death, that Frick hired architect Frederick J. Osterling to transform Clayton, to double its size, to turn it from a comfortable home into a mansion worthy of his position, and the symbolism here is almost too obvious, the way that Frick responded to loss by accumulating more, by building bigger, by surrounding himself with proof of his power and success, as if enough mahogany and marble and stained glass could fill the void left by dead children. And the renovation that Osterling designed was spectacular, adding a dramatic entrance hall with carved oak paneling and a grand staircase, installing the latest technology including electric lights powered by the house's own generator and electric call buttons that allowed the family to summon servants from any room, creating separate family and service areas so complete that servants could move through the house via hidden stairs and corridors without ever being seen by the Fricks or their guests. And this invisible architecture, this elaborate system for hiding the labor that made the family's comfort possible, was essential to the Gilded Age mansion, because part of what wealth bought was the illusion that comfort came naturally, that meals appeared and rooms cleaned themselves and clothes were always pressed and fires always stoked without any visible human effort, an illusion that required servants to be simultaneously omnipresent and invisible, to anticipate every need while remaining out of sight, to live their entire lives in the shadows and margins of the house, and at Clayton this meant 11 full-time servants, a butler to manage the household and serve at meals, a housekeeper to supervise the female staff and maintain standards, a cook to prepare the elaborate multi-course dinners that the Fricks served to guests, multiple maids to clean the 23 rooms and make beds and dust furniture and empty chamber pots, a laundress to wash and iron the mountains of linens and clothes that a wealthy family generated, a coachman to maintain the carriages and horses and later the automobiles, and these servants lived on the premises in quarters on the upper floors, small rooms with sloped ceilings and minimal furniture, rooms that in some cases had white tile on the walls like a hospital or prison, rooms that were cold in winter and stifling in summer, rooms that announced through their very architecture that the people who slept there were not quite human, not quite worthy of comfort, not quite entitled to the same considerations as the family they served, and these servants, most of them young women, worked 17-hour days, starting before dawn to light fires and prepare breakfast and continuing past midnight when the final dinner dishes were washed and the last guest had departed, and they did this 6.5 days a week, with only Sunday afternoons off, for wages of $20 to $30 a month, which worked out to less than 50 cents a day, less than what a skilled factory worker might earn in an hour, and they had no privacy, no freedom, no life outside of service. They were summoned by electric bells at all hours, expected to respond immediately, expected to be grateful for the opportunity to work in such a fine house, expected to remain invisible, to move silently through the hallways, to never speak unless spoken to accept without complaint or question the hierarchy that placed them at the bottom and the Fricks at the top, and we know some of their names now, preserved in household accounts and payroll records, women like Mary and Bridget and Catherine who dusted the same furniture and polished the same silver and made the same beds day after day after day, whose entire lives were consumed by the maintenance of someone else's comfort, whose dreams and desires and frustrations were never recorded, never considered important enough to preserve, and this erasure, this systematic deletion of servant experience from the historical record, is itself a form of violence, a reminder that even in death, even in memory, the hierarchy persists, that we know everything about what Adelaide Frick wore and what she collected and where she traveled, but we know almost nothing about the women who buttoned her dresses and packed her trunks and made her travel possible, and the bitter irony, the savage contradiction, is that these servants at Clayton were the lucky ones, at least compared to the men dying in Frick's coke ovens. At least they had shelter and regular meals and were not breathing poison or dodging molten steel, at least they were not shot by Pinkerton detectives or locked out of their jobs or evicted from company housing, at least they were alive, and this is what makes Clayton so powerful as a historical artifact, so revealing as a window into Gilded Age America. Because it shows us not just the extremes of wealth and poverty but the entire gradient, the complete hierarchy from the family in their luxurious bedrooms to the servants in their tiny quarters to the workers who never made it into the house at all, who existed only as abstractions, as sources of profit, as the invisible foundation on which everything else was built, and the house itself, with its careful segregation of space, its elaborate systems for hiding labor, Its technological innovations designed to maximize comfort and minimize contact with the people who provided that comfort. The house itself is a machine for producing and reproducing inequality, for naturalizing hierarchy, for making it seem inevitable and right that some people should live in splendor while others live in poverty, that some people should summon with the push of a button while others come running, that some people should die young in coke ovens while others collect art and travel to Europe and eat from China so fine you can see light through it. And this is what Frick was building when he expanded Clayton, not just a home but a fortress, not just a mansion but a monument to the idea that extreme inequality is not a problem but a feature, not a bug but the very point of capitalism, the reward for success, the natural order of things. And when he and Adelaide hosted dinners at Clayton, when they welcomed Pittsburgh's elite into their newly expanded home, when they showed off the carved woodwork and the imported furnishings and the art collection that Frick was beginning to assemble, what they were really doing was performing their status, demonstrating their power, establishing their place in the hierarchy, and their guests understood this, recognized the language, responded with the appropriate admiration and envy, because in Gilded Age America your worth as a person was measured by the size of your house, the number of your servants, the quality of your possessions, the visibility of your consumption, and by these standards the Fricks were winning, and winning was supposed to bring satisfaction, happiness, security, but it brought something else instead, brought a kind of emptiness that no amount of acquisition could fill, brought the knowledge that even surrounded by luxury they were not safe, not secure, not immune to loss, and this knowledge must have haunted Adelaide especially, who had lost 2 children and knew that wealth meant nothing against disease, against accident, against the random cruelties of existence. And perhaps this is why she clung so fiercely to the objects, to the furniture and the china and the carefully curated domestic environment, because objects at least could be controlled, could be preserved, could be kept exactly as you wanted them, unlike children who sickened and died, unlike servants who might leave or steal or gossip, unlike a husband who might be shot by anarchists, unlike a world that refused to stay fixed and ordered and comprehensible, and the house became her refuge, her project, her attempt to create a space where she had power, where her decisions mattered, where she could determine at least the color of the wallpaper and the placement of the furniture even if she could not determine whether her children would live or die. And after Homestead, after the battle that made the Frick name synonymous with violence, after Berkman's assassination attempt that brought death right into Henry's office, the house must have felt even more necessary, even more precious, a sanctuary against a hostile world, a place where the ugliness could be kept out, where the servants knew their place and the children were safe and everything was clean and ordered and under control, except that it wasn't, except that the violence was always there, was built into every brick, was implicit in every relationship, was the foundation on which the entire structure rested, and by these standards the Fricks were winning, and that was supposed to be enough, that was supposed to bring satisfaction, happiness, security. But then came July 1892, came Homestead. Came the moment when the contradictions that Clayton simultaneously revealed and concealed exploded into violence, because Homestead was not some unfortunate accident, not some isolated incident, but the logical culmination of everything that Frick believed and practiced, the moment when the war he had been waging on workers for 20 years became literal rather than metaphorical, became bullets and blood rather than wage cuts and blacklists. And what happened at Homestead, what Frick ordered to happen, was not some desperate last resort but a calculated strategy, a deliberate escalation, a message sent not just to the workers at that one mill but to workers everywhere that resistance would be met with overwhelming force, that capital would use any means necessary to maintain control, that the choice was submission or destruction, and Frick planned it carefully, built a 12-foot fence around the mill with slits for rifles and topped with barbed wire, locked out the workers weeks before the contract expired, refused all attempts at negotiation, and then, when the workers barricaded themselves inside the mill and declared they would not be moved, Frick hired the Pinkertons, 300 armed men with a reputation for violence, strikebreakers who had crushed unions across America, men who came with rifles and clubs and the willingness to use them, and Frick told them to take the mill, to land at dawn and secure the facility and prepare it for strikebreakers, and he must have known this would lead to violence, must have calculated that the workers would resist, must have understood that people were likely to die, and he ordered it anyway, because to Frick the calculation was simple, the cost of breaking the strike, even if it included deaths, was less than the cost of accepting union wages, and the steel industry's profit margins depended on cheap labor, depended on workers who had no bargaining power, depended on the ability to set wages unilaterally, to speed up production, to cut corners on safety, to extract maximum value from each worker's body. Before that body wore out and could be replaced, and unions threatened this entire system, threatened to give workers a voice, threatened to establish the principle that labor had rights, that management had obligations, that the market was not the only force that should determine wages and conditions, and this threat, to Frick and Carnegie and the other industrial titans of the age, was existential, was revolutionary, was intolerable, and so the Pinkertons came, and the battle unfolded exactly as it had to unfold given the forces Frick had put into motion, and when it was over, when the dead were counted and the wounded were carried away and the National Guard arrived to occupy the town, Frick had won, the strike was broken, the union was destroyed, wages were cut, hours were increased, and Carnegie Steel's profits soared, rising from $4.5 million in 1892 to $11 million by 1899, and every penny of that increase was extracted from workers who now had less bargaining power, less protection, less hope, and in the cold calculus of capitalism Frick's decision was vindicated, was proven correct, was rewarded with wealth and power and the admiration of other industrialists who saw him as a man willing to do what was necessary, and the workers of Homestead, those who hadn't been blacklisted or forced to leave town, went back to the mill under worse conditions than before, worked longer hours for less pay, accepted the discipline of management without complaint, and tried to forget that there had ever been a battle, that they had ever believed they could win, that resistance was ever possible, and this forgetting, this erasure of the moment when workers fought back and believed they could prevail, was perhaps Frick's greatest victory, because it taught not just the workers at Homestead but workers everywhere that resistance was futile, that capital was too strong, that the choice was accept our terms or starve, and this lesson, internalized across American industry, shaped labor relations for decades, created a climate of fear and submission that allowed the robber barons to accumulate unprecedented fortunes while workers lived in poverty, and all of this violence and exploitation and systematic immiseration of the working class, all of this is embedded in Clayton, is present in every room, is implicit in every luxury, because the house and the fortune that built it are inseparable from Homestead, are products of the same system, expressions of the same logic, and you cannot tour Clayton without touring Homestead, cannot admire the carved oak without remembering the barges, cannot appreciate the electric lights without thinking about the men who died to generate the profits that paid for them, but there was a cost, a reckoning, a response, and it came 17 days later when Alexander Berkman, a 21-year-old Russian Jewish anarchist who had been radicalized by the plight of workers, who believed in propaganda of the deed, who thought that assassinating a tyrant would inspire the masses to revolution, walked into Frick's office in Pittsburgh and shot him 3 times, and then, when Frick incredibly remained standing, pulled out a knife and stabbed him in the leg and neck, and then, when Frick still fought back, tried to set off a dynamite cap in his mouth, and even then Frick did not die, did not surrender, fought Berkman off with the help of his employees, and then insisted the doctor treat his wounds right there in the office, and then finished his workday, reading and signing papers with bullets still in his body, and then went home, presumably to Clayton, to Adelaide who must have been terrified, to the children who must have been confused and frightened, to the servants who whispered among themselves about what had happened, and imagine Adelaide in that moment, receiving word that her husband had been shot, had been stabbed, had nearly been killed, imagine her waiting at Clayton not knowing if he would survive, not knowing if she would become a widow, not knowing how to explain to Childs and Helen why their father was in danger, and when Frick finally arrived home, bandaged and pale but alive, what did they say to each other, what comfort could she offer, what reassurance could he give, how did they explain to themselves that this was the price of success, that attempted assassination was just another cost of doing business, that this was the world they had chosen to inhabit, and Frick's survival, his refusal to show weakness, his determination to continue working despite his wounds, became part of his legend, evidence of his toughness, his resolve, his superiority to the anarchist who had tried to kill him, and the press, which had been skeptical of Frick after Homestead, which had begun asking uncomfortable questions about who was really responsible for the violence, suddenly shifted, suddenly Frick was the victim, Suddenly public sympathy swung back toward the wounded industrialist and away from the striking workers, and Berkman, who thought his action would inspire the masses, found instead that he had helped the enemy, had given Frick exactly what he needed, a way to reframe the narrative, to shift blame, to emerge not as the aggressor but as the target of senseless anarchist violence, and Berkman went to prison for 14 years, during which time he learned that propaganda of the deed did not work as theory predicted, that individual violence could not overthrow systems, that revolution required organization and solidarity and sustained collective action, not dramatic gestures that the powerful could easily absorb and redirect, and Berkman emerged from prison a different person, still radical but more thoughtful, more strategic, more aware of the complexity of social change, and he lived until 1936, long enough to see the labor movement rise again, to see workers win victories that seemed impossible in 1892, to see the New Deal establish principles of collective bargaining and workplace regulation that validated everything the Homestead workers had fought for, but also long enough to see those victories prove incomplete, to see capital adapt and find new ways to exploit labor, to see the same battles fought again in different forms, and through it all Clayton stood unchanged, a monument to a moment, a capsule of 1892, and during the strike collapse, during those terrible months after Homestead when it became clear that the workers had lost, when the union was destroyed and the wage cuts were implemented and men who had fought the Pinkertons were blacklisted from every mill in the region, during those months the town of Homestead descended into despair, families lost their homes, children went hungry, men who had been skilled workers found themselves unemployed and unemployable, reduced to begging or leaving or accepting whatever degrading work they could find, and the community that had stood together on July 6, that had believed in solidarity and resistance, fractured under the pressure of defeat. Neighbors blamed each other for the failure, accused each other of not fighting hard enough or fighting too recklessly, families feuded over who said what and who did what, and the fabric of trust that had made collective action possible unraveled, and this too was part of Frick's victory, not just breaking the union but breaking the community, not just lowering wages but destroying the social bonds that made resistance thinkable, and Homestead became a cautionary tale, a warning to other workers about what happened when you challenged capital, and men in mills across Pennsylvania and Ohio and Illinois looked at what happened to Homestead and made the calculation that submission was safer than resistance, that poverty was better than starvation, that accepting exploitation was better than fighting and losing, and the labor movement that had been growing in strength through the 1880s stalled, retreated, went underground, and would not emerge again with real power until the 1930s, 40 years later, and those 40 years of defeat, of submission, of accepting whatever terms capital offered, those years can be traced directly back to Homestead, to the battle that Frick won not just militarily but psychologically, not just in terms of broken bodies but broken spirits, and all of this history, all of this suffering and defeat and despair, is embedded in the walls of Clayton, is part of what the house means, is inseparable from its beauty and its luxury and its carefully preserved authenticity. And when we tour Clayton and admire its craftsmanship and its elegance and its historical significance, we are also touring a crime scene, are also walking through evidence of violence, are also implicitly endorsing the system that made such houses possible, unless we consciously resist that endorsement, unless we actively work to see what the house wants to hide, unless we remember that for every room in Clayton there were 1,000 coke ovens, that for every servant who polished silver there were 100 men breathing poison, that for every dinner party there were 1,000 families going hungry, and this work of remembering, of connecting, of refusing to let beauty obscure brutality, this is the moral work that Clayton demands of us, and it is hard work, uncomfortable work, work that ruins the aesthetic experience of touring a historic mansion, work that makes it impossible to simply enjoy the craftsmanship and the period details and the stories about how the Fricks lived. Because once you see the connection, once you understand that the house and the ovens are part of the same system, once you recognize that Adelaide's China collection was purchased with the lives of men whose names we don't know, you cannot unsee it, cannot unknow it, cannot go back to innocent appreciation, and perhaps this is why most historic house museums work so hard to keep these connections hidden, to focus on the family stories and the decorative arts and the architecture, to present the past as a series of aesthetic choices rather than as a system of exploitation. Because if visitors understood the full context, understood what these houses really meant, understood the human cost Of every luxury, they might not enjoy the tour, might not recommend the museum to their friends, might not donate to the preservation fund, might leave with uncomfortable questions about their own lives, their own choices, their own complicity in contemporary systems of exploitation that operate on the same principles that built Clayton, and historic house museums or businesses, are competing for tourist dollars, are trying to create an experience that people will pay for and enjoy, and uncomfortable truths are bad for business, are not what people want when they spend their Saturday afternoon touring a historic mansion, and so the truth gets softened, gets contextualized, gets presented as regrettable but understandable, as the way things were, as something that we can acknowledge without dwelling on, as history rather than as ongoing crime, and the tour guides, who are usually knowledgeable and well-meaning, who genuinely love the house and its history, who can tell you exactly which pieces of furniture are original and which are period reproductions. These tour guides have been trained to manage the discomfort, to acknowledge the problematic aspects without letting them dominate the narrative, to remind visitors that we can't judge the past by present standards, that everyone was doing it, that the Fricks were actually better employers than some, that we should focus on the positive, on the preservation, on the educational value, on the art collection, on anything other than the fundamental question of whether such wealth was ever justified, whether the cost was ever acceptable, whether we have learned anything, whether things have really changed. And so we tour Clayton and we learn about Adelaide's love of porcelain and Frick's interest in European art and the technological innovations of the 1890s and the architectural details of Victorian domestic design. And we admire the craftsmanship and we appreciate the preservation and we take our photographs and we buy our postcards and we leave feeling educated and cultured and connected to history, and we never quite confront the fact that we have just toured a monument to exploitation, have just walked through rooms built on the bodies of workers, have just participated in the ongoing rehabilitation of a man who hired private armies to shoot his employees, and this is what Frick ultimately bought with his fortune, not just comfort and luxury and art, but redemption, or at least the appearance of redemption, the possibility that future generations would remember him as a collector and a philanthropist and a builder rather than as the man who crushed the Homestead Strike, and to a large extent this purchase has succeeded, because most people who visit the Frick collection in New York know nothing about Homestead, have never heard of the Pinkertons, have no idea that the Vermeers and Rembrandts they're admiring were purchased with blood money, and even at Clayton, even with the Homestead history right there in the museum's own materials, even with photographs of the coke ovens on display, most visitors still leave thinking of Frick as a complicated figure rather than as a villain, still willing to grant him the benefit of nuance, still accepting the premise that his achievements in industry and art somehow balance or mitigate or contextualize his crimes against labor. And this willingness to grant nuance, to see both sides, to acknowledge complexity, this is presented as sophistication, as historical thinking, as the mature adult perspective that moves beyond simple moral judgments. But it is also a way of avoiding judgment altogether, of refusing to draw conclusions, of treating history as a series of interesting puzzles rather than as a record of ongoing injustice, and in this refusal, in this cultivation of sophisticated neutrality, we become complicit, we become participants in the same system that built Clayton, we accept the premise that extreme wealth is morally neutral, that how you acquire a fortune is less important than what you do with it afterward, that philanthropy can cleanse money of its origins, that enough time and enough art and enough careful preservation can transform a robber baron into a respected historical figure, and perhaps this is the real reason Clayton was preserved exactly as it was, not as a memorial to the Frick family but as a template for how to launder a reputation, how to transform exploitation into respectability, how to ensure that the winners write history. And yet despite all this, despite the careful curation and the softened narratives and the sophisticated refusal to judge, despite everything that Clayton wants to be, the house cannot help but tell the truth, cannot help but reveal the system, cannot help but show us exactly how extreme inequality works and what it costs and who pays the price, because the architecture itself is an argument, the servants' quarters are evidence, the call buttons are a confession, and if we are willing to look, if we are willing to see, if we are willing to connect what we're seeing to systems that persist today, then Clayton becomes not a rehabilitation of Frick but an indictment, not a celebration of Gilded Age achievement but a revelation of Gilded Age violence, not a museum that lets us escape into a simpler past but a mirror that shows us an uncomfortable present, and this is why Clayton matters, why it endures, why it haunts, because it is both monument and evidence, both memorial and indictment, both celebration and critique, and visiting Clayton means. Confronting these contradictions, means standing in the entrance hall with its carved oak and its electric call buttons and its implicit violence, means walking through the restored rooms where every object is authentic and asking what authenticity means when the authentic thing is a machine for producing inequality, means climbing to the servants' quarters and standing in those tiny rooms with their sloped ceilings and white tile walls and trying to imagine 17-hour days, trying to imagine living your entire life in service to people who saw you as furniture, trying to imagine what it would be like to press the call button versus to hear it ringing, and this imaginative work, this effort to see the house from multiple positions simultaneously, is the moral and political work that Clayton demands, and it is hard work, uncomfortable work, work that implicates us as visitors because we benefit from the same systems that built Clayton, because the mechanisms of exploitation have not disappeared but only changed form, because the concentration of wealth continues and accelerates, because there are still servants' quarters, still invisible labor, still workers dying to make other people rich, still mansions being built on hidden foundations of suffering, and Clayton, in its perfect preservation, in its refusal to soften the story, in its commitment to showing the full picture, forces us to see this, forces us to connect past and present, forces us to ask what we are doing about it, what role we play, what responsibility we bear, and these are not comfortable questions, not questions with easy answers, not questions that most museums want to raise because they might make visitors uncomfortable, might make them leave without buying something from the gift shop, might challenge the narrative that history is past and we have learned from it and things are better now, but Clayton, at its best, refuses that easy comfort, insists on difficulty, on complexity, on the recognition that we have not resolved these contradictions but only displaced them, that the choice is still whether to see clearly or to look away, whether to tell the full story or only the pleasant parts, whether to reckon with the cost or to pretend there isn't one, and this is what makes Clayton not just a museum but a mirror, not just history but commentary, not just preservation but provocation, because the house, in its honesty, in its refusal to perform innocence, in its insistence that beauty and brutality are not opposites but accomplices, the house reveals something that American capitalism has always tried to hide, which is that there is no ethical way to accumulate vast wealth, that every fortune of the Gilded Age and of our own age rests on exploitation, that the distance between the family quarters and the servants' quarters, between the coke baron and the coke oven worker, between those who summon and those who come running, is not natural or inevitable or the result of merit but is produced and maintained through violence, through coercion, through systems designed to extract value from the many for the benefit of the few, and Clayton stands as evidence of this truth, as proof that cannot be dismissed or explained away, as a permanent record of how things were and therefore how things might still be, and when we leave Clayton, when we walk back out through the gardens and past the greenhouse and onto Penn Avenue, we carry this knowledge with us whether we want to or not. We have seen behind the curtain, we have stood in the servants' quarters, we have pressed the call button, we have looked at the coke oven photographs, we have read about Homestead, we have connected the dots, and we cannot unsee what we have seen, cannot unknow what we have learned, cannot pretend anymore that beauty and blood are separate, that houses like Clayton are innocent, that we are innocent for admiring them, and perhaps this is the final gift that Henry Clay Frick, dead now for over a century, never intended to give but gave anyway through the preservation of this house, which is the truth, uncomfortable and undeniable, that class war is real, that it has been going on since the beginning, that it never stopped, that we are all still living in the world that men like Frick built, still navigating the hierarchies they established, still choosing every day whether to press the button or answer its ring, whether to live in the family quarters or the servants' quarters, whether to be a Frick or a worker in the coke ovens, and Clayton asks us which side we are on, demands that we answer, refuses to let us remain neutral, because neutrality in the face of such evidence is itself a choice, a decision to side with power, to accept the system, to believe the lie that this is natural, inevitable, the way things have to be, and if we reject that lie, if we see Clayton for what it is, if we understand that the beauty and the blood are inseparable, then we are obligated to act, to resist, to build something different, to create a world where beauty does not require brutality, where mansions are not built on the bodies of workers, where children do not die in coke ovens so that other children can play with imported toys in carefully preserved nurseries, and this is the dark story of Clayton, the story that the house itself tells even when the tour guides try to soften it, even when the museum literature tries to contextualize it, even when we try to look away. Because the house remembers, the walls remember, the servants' quarters remember, the call buttons remember, the coke smoke stains that were never quite cleaned away remember, and they are asking us, all these years later, whether we have learned anything, whether we have changed anything, whether we are any different from the people who walked these halls and rang these bells and accepted this hierarchy as natural and right, or whether we are still living in Henry Clay Frick's world, still playing by Henry Clay Frick's rules, still building our own versions of Clayton on foundations of hidden suffering, still telling ourselves that somehow, this time, the beauty is worth the cost, that somehow, this time, the fairy tale is true, that somehow, this time, the blood will wash clean, but Clayton knows better, has always known better, and now, if we are honest, if we are brave, if we are willing to see, we know better too, and that knowledge, that uncomfortable truth, that recognition of complicity and connection, is what we take with us when we leave, is what makes Clayton not just a historic house but a living challenge. Not just a museum but a moral demand, not just a window into the past but a mirror reflecting the present, and in that mirror we see ourselves, see our choices, see the world we are building or accepting or failing to challenge, and Clayton asks us, with every preserved room and every restored artifact and every carefully maintained detail, what we are going to do about it, how we are going to live, which side we are going to choose. And the only unacceptable answer is to pretend we didn't hear the question, to walk away unchanged, to admire the beauty and ignore the blood, to tour the house and learn nothing except dates and architectural terms and the names of furniture styles, because Clayton demands more than that, deserves more than that, and the workers who died in the coke ovens deserve more than that, and the servants who spent their lives in those tiny rooms deserve more than that, and the workers who fought at Homestead deserve more than that, and we owe it to them, and to ourselves, and to the future we are building, to see clearly, to remember fully, to judge honestly, to act accordingly, and to never, ever pretend that the cost was acceptable, that the beauty justifies the brutality, that houses like Clayton are anything other than what they are, which is monuments to a system that destroys human beings to create luxury for the few, and if we can see that, if we can hold that truth, if we can carry it with us back into our own lives and our own world, then perhaps Clayton has served its highest purpose, has become not just a museum of the past but a teacher for the present, not just a preservation of history but a provocation toward justice, not just a monument to what was but a challenge to what might be, and this, finally, is why the house stands, why it matters, why we return to it, because Clayton, in its terrible honesty, in its refusal to look away, in its insistence on showing us the full cost of inequality, gives us something that no amount of careful curation or sophisticated contextualization can diminish, which is the truth, and the truth, however uncomfortable, however damning, however implicated we all are in it, is the only foundation on which we can build something better.